I'm finally ready to read some more New Worlds. So I've got New Worlds Quarterly 3 here ready to go. It's another beautiful Barclay cover. As usual, we got some familiar names. Disch, Robert Aldiss, and some new ones. Charles Platt, who I'm interested in reading. He ends up taking over the editorial responsibilities for New Worlds later on. We got the Harrison commentary in the back, which I'm dying to get to. Always a treat to read Harrison's essays. Some of the unfamiliar names are actually more familiar than you'd think, which is interesting. So we'll be getting to that very shortly. So I'm going to do what I did last time. I'm going to read each story and then review them. I might do 2 or 3 at a time just to keep it rolling, especially if there are a couple of stories I don't like and I don't have much to say. But yeah, that way I can give you my thoughts while they're fresh in my head. Hopefully it's a bit more interesting that way, rather than me trying to cobble together a few half-remembered thoughts by the end of it. That's what I tend to be like with short story collections. I find it very difficult to think back in detail on all of the stories by the time I've read the whole thing. Maybe that's just me, I don't know. I have a weird memory, I think. New Worlds Quarterly 3 came out in 1972, March of that year, and Moorcock spends the introduction bemoaning the conservative nature of the science fiction fan base, which is a very funny thing to do in the introduction to a science fiction anthology. He's not wrong though, and things haven't changed that much. He takes a shot at the science fiction awards, in particular the Nebula Award, which he says has degraded to the extent of the Hugo Awards. And he asks, what is the point in having an expertly judged award if they're just going to give that award to terrible books? The example he cites is the winner of the year before, which he says was the worst of all the books that were nominated that year. I thought that was interesting, so I went online to check what that book was, and it was A Time of Changes by Robert Silverberg, which I've actually heard quite good things about, but I'm not that surprised to hear anyone complaining about Robert Silverberg after reading Dying Inside, and that book was just terrible. I'm sorry. I know there are a lot of people that like that book, and it's often given as an example of a good new wave book, but nah, it was really bad. It's incredibly racist and sexist. I'm not one of those people who will accuse a book of being racist or sexist just because there are racist or sexist characters. It was definitely the author of that book being racist and sexist. So yeah, that put me off Robert Silverberg quite a bit. But, you know, I think he's got some good books out there. Moorcock says Time of Changes is not one of them. Science fiction authors in the 70s were so catty to each other. It's extremely funny. Moorcock is still complimentary to the SFWA, who run the Nebula Award, and says they've done good work in improving conditions for science fiction writers, but he implies they shouldn't necessarily be in charge of assessing the literary quality of science fiction. Moorcock then puts out a call for better science fiction criticism, which is, again, extremely timely of him. I think this is the same year that Darko Suvin publishes his essay Poetics on the Science Fiction Genre, where he introduces concepts like cognitive estrangement into science fiction criticism, which he develops into his seminal thesis Metamorphoses of Science Fiction, which is published at the end of the decade, which effectively causes a revolution in science fiction criticism. I've been dipping into that recently, and yeah, it's really interesting. It seems like something you have to reckon with if you are interested in science fiction criticism, you know, whether you're in favour of it or not. I can only imagine what Moorcock thinks of the Nebula Award now, considering in the 70s it was still pretty good, I think. I'm just looking at the list now. What books was Time of Changes up against in 1971? Paul Anderson's Bywilder, R.A. Lafferty, The Devil is Dead, T.J. Bass, Half Past Human, Ursula K. Le Guin, The Lathe of Heaven, Kate Wilhelm, Margaret and I. I've heard really good things about Kate Wilhelm, I haven't read it yet. The only one I've read of them is The Lathe of Heaven by Le Guin, which I think is great. It's, in my mind, Ursula Le Guin writing a Philip K. Dick book better than Philip K. Dick could, which I know is a controversial statement, but there you go. So 73 is Rendezvous with Rama, which is probably one of the first science fiction books I read, which I loved at the time, but I don't know how well it would measure up today. People still like it. If I'm remembering it correctly, I feel like it's an extremely good example of what the Golden Age can produce. It was up against Gravity's Rainbow. I didn't know Pynchon was ever nominated for a Nebula Award. That's mad. I haven't read Pynchon. I will at some point, but I seriously doubt Arthur C. Clarke can compete with Thomas Pynchon. 74 was The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin, which is one of my favourite books. Man, that was a good year. It was up against Thomas Disch's 334. I've read one of the stories in that book, and it blew me away. And Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said, which is one of Philip K. Dick's better books, I think. And 75, so many were nominated. This is mad. The Forever War won it. Joe Haldeman's book. A classic that I still haven't read. Tanith Lee's The Birthgrave. Weirdly, I've read the sequel to that, but Shadowfire, or the other title is Vazkor, Son of Vazkor, which is a very funny title. I thought that book was amazing. I mean, anything Tanith Lee writes is amazing. It seems to me anyway, so far, in my reading of Tanith Lee. I've heard The Birthgrave's really good. Dahlgren was nominated that year. Delaney's Beat adjacent book. Guernica Night by Malmsberg. That's not my favourite Malmsberg. It's the bleakest and the most depressing. It is still good though. It's a good existential book. Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. That is a mad year, 1975. Crazy. If you go into the 80s, like 85, Ender's Game. This is like the descent of the genre, right? Orson Scott Card won it 2 years in a row. God. And then Pat Murphy, Lois McMaster Bujold. I keep hearing good things about her, but yeah, I haven't read her yet. Stations of the Tide by Michael Swanwick, 1991. That's meant to be a good book. That sounds really interesting. The quality of books awarded seems to drop off precipitously after 2010. Far more dodgy decisions come in later on in the Nebula Award, which I'm sure Michael Moorcock was extremely happy about. I always love reading Moorcock talk about science fiction and fantasy. He's always got interesting stuff to say. He always seems incredibly on the ball with what's going on at the time. I had a very different idea of him as an author before I started reading these introductions. All I had in my mind was like the Elric books, the Eternal Champion stuff, but he has an incredibly astute critical eye, and I think I've got to read more of his books, particularly his later ones, I guess, where he's not just, churning out the pulp for money. So yeah, I'm going to read the first story, which is The Machine in Shaft 10, which is an M. John Harrison story. There's a nice illustration here. Really nice to have the illustrations again. It's a nice touch for an anthology, I think. But yeah, see you in a sec. Oh shit. Fuck, already happening. Jesus Christ. They really should have used a better glue. Barclay Science Fiction. Skimping on the glue. The first story is The Machine in Shaft 10, which you may recognise as being an M. John Harrison story, but here it's credited to Joyce Churchill, the pseudonym, which is interesting considering he's got a critical essay at the end published under his real name. Like I said in my review of New World's Quarterly 2, fairly sure I would have read all the M. John Harrison stories that come up in these New World Quarterlies because I've read his short story collection, The Machine in Shaft 10, named after this story, and they're all in there basically. But I really don't mind. I'm very happy to reread Harrison, and yeah, I like this story. It's like a thought experiment / allegory, like what if a machine was discovered at the center of the earth that was converting human emotion into energy and sending it towards the sun? Yeah,
I've talked about M. John Harrison and his anti-ideology stance before, and yeah, this is like a prime example of that. This is probably the least subtle M. John Harrison story I've read. That's not to say it's not good. Most of his other stuff is a lot more abstruse, you know? It's written from the point of view of a politician who has been recently ousted from power. They've lost their position in the cabinet. They're giving you their account of the events that surrounded this machine in Shaft 10. And I really like the beginning. Where he's just like, yeah, I wasn't really following the story at first because, you know, I had my own stuff going on. I have a life. Yeah, it's like that. That's a nice touch. I had more important things to worry about than, you know, this news story. Via, like, this National Geographic article, which is a very Borges thing as well, to kind of introduce the story through a publication like that. And TV broadcasts, you get drip-fed details about this machine in Shaft 10, although the details are pretty slight. I do quite like this absurdist style of science fiction when they're just like, yeah, we proved it's a machine converting human emotion and transmitting it into space. Don't worry about how. Like, let's move on. Pretty scant on the description of the machine as well later on when they see it. Harrison talks about organoplastic materials, and it looks like an alien fruit covered in parasites. But he actually says, I can't tell you what it looked like exactly inside because I don't have the copyright. But if you saw the recent Sunday supplements, you know, you would get the idea, which is dangerously close to the sense of humor that can rub me up the wrong way. But I did find it quite funny. It's quite charming, ultimately. Probably because you can sense M. John Harrison's bitterness behind every word. That definitely helps. But yeah, this government minister, he ends up privately financing the scientist who discovered it, and unbeknownst to him at first, funding an assault on the shaft they've sunk down to it so that they can destroy it. You can't really spoil this story. It was essentially the same experience for me reading it a second time as the first time. In terms of the anti-ideology thing, you know, there's an element of this where, you know, Harrison is 26 writing this, which is, first of all, really impressive because it's incredibly well written. His style hasn't fully developed yet. When the narration is a bit stepped back and you're receiving this kind of history through this politician, it does feel a bit more like Borges or maybe Ballad, you know, like somewhere between those two. But when the narrative distance kind of zooms into more of like an in-the-moment impression of Lutkin, is the name of the politician, in the shaft and his experience going down to see the machine, that's when the writing becomes distinctly Harrison, with that very deliberate descriptive writing. And even like the descriptions of the Midlands, which has been transformed by the sinking of these shafts into like a volcanic area with like electrical storms going on and that sort of thing, which really reminded me of the imagery in Running Down. That's a similar thing going on when that story reaches its climax. But yeah, Harrison is young writing this, and I think there is an element of, you know, mid-20s guy looking at religion and the whole capitalism versus communism thing and being like, oh, I just want to do my own thing. I'm smart because I want to go the third way. And like, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I agree with the idea that manipulation of people via ideology, which is the main thing that Harrison seems to be criticizing here, I agree that's a bad thing. But the impression that like we should liberate ourselves completely from ideology, I think that's impossible. I think like you have ideology whether you like it or not. And just because you excise yourself from one ideology doesn't mean you're not in a new ideology. You know, it's just a set of beliefs and principles that guide your way of thinking. You know, and I think what's better is to be more deliberate about choosing your ideology based on ethical reasoning and evidence, I guess. I don't know. To a certain extent, it's probably an issue of semantics. I think Harrison would probably agree with that. I mean, definitely now. I think, he's young here. I think he develops these ideas going forward. But yeah, it's a good story. I like it. It's a similar kind of style to Settling the World, where God is a giant beetle found on the far side of the moon. That similarly uses these absurdist assumptions, right? How do they know the machine's converting emotion? How do they know this giant beetle is God? This is a quote of the scientist describing his proof. I have shown beyond doubt, I believe, that our emotions, subsequent to their processing at the core of the Earth, are converted to an essentially radiological energy and projected into space in the direction of the sun. We have no descriptive systems capable of dealing with whatever changes they affect there. We must, however, as my recently published work shows, view this as an artificial process, and more important, a process of very long standing indeed. Gentlemen, we have no option but to assume that the joys and miseries of man are fuel for some gigantic cosmic machine that since our evolution as an emotion-bearing species, we have been used. That our most public triumphs and our most sordid personal tragedies may be the oil that runs the galactic bakery van. How does it feel, gentlemen, to be a resource? That does remind me, there's a couple of logical leaps in the story that don't quite work for me. Like, this scientist proves that the machine is fueled by human emotion, and then we make a jump to ideological conflict as the main driver, which, I can see that jump is in like the fervor of ideological conflict, right? But then the story shifts to everyone assuming that they have no control over their own destinies because of the machine. And I didn't really get that. And there's this like new cult that pops up where everyone's mass suiciding, and Lutkin makes a point at the end that was just another ideology. It's maybe not like the most rigorously thought through story, particularly by Harrison, but yeah, still worth reading. It's still good. And it's very accessible. It's not a bad first story to read by Harrison to kind of ease you in to his style, which isn't always the easiest thing to read. But yeah, Joyce Churchill and John Harrison. So I'll move on to the next story, which is I Lose Medea by Alistair Bevan. There's the illustration. Alistair Bevan is another one where I was like, never heard of that guy. Also, a very Scottish first name, a very Welsh last name. I mean, by no means impossible, but it just felt a bit off. So I looked it up, and it's Keith Roberts. So, yeah, very excited to read this. I love Keith Roberts. He actually has another story in his collection under his own name, The Grain Kings, illustrated by him as well. Yeah, I'm interested in what's going on here because particularly in the early 20th century, pseudonyms were used by genre writers so that they could get away with publishing more material than they would under one name. But they're using a real name and a pseudonym for the same anthology here. So I can't help but feel like they're doing this to make it look like they have more authors writing for New Worlds than they do. I don't know. Very weird, very suspect behavior. Hey, if that means I get more M. John Harrison and Keith Roberts in here, I'm happy. So yeah, I'll get on reading I Lose Medea. Okay, so I read the next 3 stories, and I was disappointed by 2 of them, and quite impressed by one of them. All of which surprised me, actually, for different reasons. So, I Lose Medea by Alistair Bevan, who's really Keith Roberts. That's a pseudonym he was using for a few years in the late 60s, I think. Is not great. It's a guy camping with his girlfriend, annoyed by some young Scandinavians turning up to the same campsite. Very, very middle-class English vibes. There are ghosts. That was kind of interesting. There are like these smoky ghosts at the beginning, and you don't know what's going on there, and you never find out. Yeah, it moves on. He goes for a walk, he leaves his girlfriend to like make dinner. There's so much casual misogyny in this. He's like constantly annoyed by his girlfriend, but then keeps thinking, oh, well, she's very attractive. So yeah, that's not so good. Yeah, he leaves her to make dinner and goes and watches some gunmen attacking some castles. And it goes on like that. It just keeps going. I'm fairly certain that this is just a dream Keith Roberts had, and he woke up and he wrote it down, and that's the story. There's a temptation to think that an interesting dream would be an interesting story, but it very rarely is. I don't want to be listening to someone else's dream. It's dull. Yeah, so that's what that was like. Have nothing more to say about it. What else? Oh, and that illustration, that is Keith Roberts as well. Kingston is a pseudonym for Roberts. I think he always liked to do his own illustrations. Yeah, and then we had Brian Aldiss. So these are two authors I've been really excited by recently. I've been really enjoying them. But yeah, I wasn't too into this either. As for our fatal continuity, there's no illustration. Sorry, I had to shift slightly because the sun keeps moving. I've chosen a really bad spot. The oldest story is it's like a satire of art criticism, very academic language. It's a bio of this artist's life who did his work on the verge of some biological revolution in form. It's very cryptic and vague, and it mainly seemed to be used by Aldiss as a vessel for using the famous last words of lots of famous people in a funny way, which I didn't find very funny. Yeah, and that's that. It's only a few pages, but I didn't like it. I wasn't a fan. But then I read Julio 204, again, no illustration, by Pamela Sargent, and this was great. And the reason I'm surprised I like this, I've heard of Pamela Sargent. I haven't read anything by her before, but she's one of those names that floats around. I think she wrote some Star Trek tie-in novels with George Zebrowski, who has a story in this collection as well later on. But yeah, the reason I'm surprised I enjoyed it is because it's an overpopulation story, which is one of my least favourite science fiction tropes or motifs or whatever. I use the word trope too much. I hate that word, but it can fill most gaps, you know. If someone's going on about overpopulation to you, you know you're about 10 seconds away from hearing how it's some particular type of person's fault, right? And let me tell you, they're never white people. And I think part of the reason I liked it is because a lot of the nuance, I think, is often missing from overpopulation narratives, was present here. In this story, Sargent has people being racist because of the overpopulation issue, which I thought was a nice turn. I hadn't seen before, but I haven't read that much of it, to be fair. I mean, maybe John Brunner does that sort of thing, but from what I have read of Brunner, I wouldn't trust him at all on race issues. So yeah, I thought that was cool. Also, the main character is a piece of shit. He is the worst person you can imagine. And yeah, he's really misogynistic and sexist in this story. But, well, big surprise, women authors are much better at writing misogyny in a realistic way. In the Alistair Bevan story, the Roberts story, you felt like you were meant to be sympathetic with the character's misogyny, which is gross. Whereas here, you know the character's meant to be a piece of shit. Because, I'll just read the opening paragraph. This hits so hard. Dr. Simon Negron arose from bed and looked back at the sleeping woman. The blood on her stomach and breasts was drying. The dead man's corpse was curled in a fetal position at her feet. Simon walked around his side of the bed, gave the man's body a nudge, and it rolled to the floor, flopping onto its back. The corpse's eyes still stared, and its mouth hung open, its tongue lolling out the side. It was a well-formed body, Simon noted, the only incongruities being the knife wounds that marred the firm muscles and the bloodied area where its genitals had once been. Jesus Christ. I picked this book up last night, and I was like, do I really fancy reading one of these stories right now? I'm not sure if I'm in the mood. I read that paragraph and I was like, I just got to read the whole thing now. That's really horrible. Shocking. This guy and his girlfriend, they're just picking up people from the street and murdering them in their room for entertainment, because the value of human life is so low now. And something I found quite interesting as well is it turns out they're both from the street. They've managed to clamber out into the middle classes. They're not starving and living on the measly rations the government give out, which are constantly being cut, the constant cuts. There's talk in the canteen about how they should cut all that welfare. People should pay their way. We shouldn't be giving medicine to people who can't pay. I don't know. It just felt so spot on to the moment, particularly in America right now. And the main character is a doctor. He's selling drugs on the black markets. People with genetic conditions aren't allowed medicine anymore. There's this whole eugenics stuff going on. But I thought it was super dark, dystopian, verging on noir in terms of style. Story, which, it just ends. It has no ending, really. I think this is a chapter of a book that Sargent later published, which may have been reworked in that book, called The Sudden Star or The White Death, depending on whether it was US or UK release, which I'm really interested in reading. It sounds like it's an episodic novel about this world where everything's just gone to shit and people don't value human life, and I think each chapter is a different character. Somehow she squeezed in the idea of a white hole turning up, and that has something to do with it. Who knows? But I'll probably read that. I was really impressed by this. It was probably the darkest story I've read so far in New Worlds, and some of the stories have been pretty dark. So I wouldn't recommend for a fully rounded story, because it is just the chapter from a book Sargent's working on. Well worth reading in terms of just getting a snapshot of her writing and this world she's painting a picture of, I guess. I really enjoyed it. Quite tempted now to read one of those Star Trek novels she wrote. I'll read The Sudden Star first. Up next is Tom Disch. The Wonderful World of Griswold Tractors by Tom Disch. Big fan of Tom Disch, so let's see what he has to say. Oh, okay, that was bad. I don't like this kind of story, this madcap, absurdist satire. This read like a John Sladek story. I really don't like John Sladek. I don't know. It's 100 half-baked ideas, one thing after the other. It's so loose that I find it hard to care about anything that's happening. There's no weight to anything, because it's just, and then this happened, and then this happened. He got hypnotized, and then this guy's head got chopped off, and then there was everyone took psychedelics, and then there was a businessman, and then they're trying to sell tractors, and I don't care. I hate this. Thank God it was short. It reads like a warm-up writing exercise, which is what I think it is. I think Disch is just just getting into the zone. I'll write a few pages of nonsense, which I can call satire. I don't really know what is satirizing, to be honest. But that's what they all seem to call it. And just send that off for a few quid. Possibly the most annoying kind of hack writing, it's not smart in any way. My least favorite aspect of the new wave is this sort of stuff. I just can't get on board with it. It must have had an audience, and maybe it still does. I'm sorry if you're one of those people that really likes this sort of stuff. It's just really not my kind of thing. That's just how it is. I'm particularly frustrated because I know Disch is a good writer, or he can be. Camp Concentration, man, that's a hell of a book. And that story from 334 and Gulem was amazing. I was really hoping for more of those 334 stories popping up in these New Worlds quarterlies, but that doesn't seem to be happening, which is really unfortunate. I'll just have to go and read 334 to get some of the good Disch. It's not Dish's best writing popping up in these. It's like I said, Angulem in New Worlds Quarterly 1, that was banging. That was so good.
I've had a couple of strikes since then. I mean, there's nothing to talk about. It's just a bunch of madcap shit, you know? I just read it. It's immediately gone out of my head. Yeah, that's... Oh, yeah. And I know John Sladek's coming up later as well. The Purloined butter. That sounds like it's going to be shit. Oh, okay. Never mind. It's over now. And Doug, the dog... what? Sorry. And Doug, the dog, a tomb. By Laurence James. That sounds like a pseudonym as well. Is that a pseudonym? Let's find out. Okay, it's not a pseudonym. Sorry to any Laurence James fans. But he did write under like 9 pseudonyms. James Axler, James Barton, James Drake, or Dark, sorry. Richard Hay, William James, John M. McLachlan, James McPhee, James W. Marvin, Jonathan May, Christopher Molan, Klaus Netzen, Mick Norman, and he shared a few with Keith Bulmer as well, James Frazier, Neil Langholm, Andrew Quiller. But Laurence James is his actual name. So this is the one time it is his real name. So Doug the Dog a Tomb by Laurence James. It's pretty good, I think. Yeah, it was a nice surprise. While I was reading this, I was thinking, okay, he's doing a Waiting for Godot or maybe Rosencrantz and Guildenstern sort of thing. The beginning and end of the story is formatted like a stage play. Yeah, it's very strange and enigmatic, a little bit violent, and I thought it was cool. Because I've been reading a fair amount of Brian Evenson recently, Samuel Beckett has been on my radar. It's part of my dumb guy's approach to culture, just going where the genre fiction I read sends me. His book Immobility in particular has a lot of Beckett-esque dialogue between the 2 clones that are carrying the main character through the post-apocalyptic wasteland. That's a great book. I highly recommend that. But yeah, so I've had Beckett on my mind, and I think for like the last 20 years I've been meaning to watch or read Waiting for Godot, and I've managed to avoid it for that whole time. So I thought this was a good excuse to actually do that. I think I always had it in my head that I would read it, or like I'd have to wait until it was on at the theatre. I don't know why. Like, there are so many great recordings of old plays online. I've been getting into that recently, which is it's really nice. So many on YouTube and Internet Archive, that sort of thing. But this is particularly easy to do with Samuel Beckett's plays because there was a film project in the early 2000s called Beckett on Film, which aimed to put the vast majority of Beckett's plays on film. And I've watched a few of them now. They're all great. It's definitely worth checking out. The Beckett on Film version of Waiting for Godot is amazing. I think all of the productions are coming out of the Gateway Theatre in Dublin. The Waiting for Godot recording is definitely based on the Gateway Theatre production because it has all the same actors in. There's an interview with them on YouTube as well, which was done while they were touring America in the late 90s, I guess. And yeah, it's great. Barry McGovern and Alan Stanford and who else? Johnny Murphy and Stephen Brennan. Barry McGovern and Alan Stanford in particular are outstanding. And I absolutely love the fact that because it's an Irish production, you've got Estragon and Vladimir with Irish accents, and then Pozzo, who's meant to be this like pompous, classist prick, basically, is the most English man you could imagine. And that works perfectly.
You're not Mr. Godot, sir?
I am Pozzo. Does that name mean nothing to you? I say, does that name mean nothing to you?
Pozzo. 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 Pozzo.
Pozzo!
Ah, Pozzo. Let me see. Pozzo.
Is it Pozzo or Bozzo?
Pozzo. No, I'm afraid I don't seem to be
I
able
once knew a
to...
family called Godso. The mother had a clap.
We're not from these parts, sir.
You are human beings nonetheless. as far as one can see, of the same species as myself. Of the same species as Pozzo.
So, And Dog the Dug a Tomb, the title of the story, comes from a song that Vladimir is singing at the beginning of the second act of Waiting for Godot, which, like a lot of the play, feels like nonsense, but also quite weirdly meaningful.
A dog came in. A dog came in the kitchen and stole a crust of bread, then cooked up with the ladle and beat him till he was dead. Then all the dogs came running and dug the dog a tomb. Then all the dogs came running and dug the dog a tomb and wrote upon the tombstone for the eyes of dogs to come. A dog came in the kitchen and stole a crust of bread, then cooked up with the ladle and beat him till he was dead. Then all the dogs came running and dug the dog a tomb. Then all the dogs came running and dug the dog a tomb. And dug the dog a tomb. You again. Come here till I embrace you.
Don't touch me.
Do you want me to go away? Go. Did they beat you? Go.
The story itself is set from the end of Waiting for Godot until the beginning of the next repetition of Waiting for Godot, which is what reminded me of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, right? Is what's happening to these characters when the audience isn't looking at them anymore. They say the last line of the play, well, shall we go? Yeah, let's go. And then they don't move. And then the curtain falls. And then Vladimir tells Estragon that he thinks he saw the man they were waiting for that night up in the gods, in the upper circle. Yeah, then they leave the theatre and a bunch of weird stuff happens on the streets. It's clearly like modern day, there's traffic, you know. They get cornered in an alley by what turns out to be just a little boy, which feels very similar to the play. The little boy comes every day to tell them that Godot will turn up the next day. This is where the story feels quite different. At the urging of Estragon, Vladimir kills the little boy. Estragon says to stick him, just out of nowhere, because the little boy being there is suspicious, apparently. And then Vladimir, only with partial intention, it seems, slices the boy's neck, and there's a lot of blood. And yeah, it's weird. I think Laurence James wrote that in because of a line in Waiting for Godot, this incredible line when Estragon says, you should just kill me like the other. Such a good line, very unsettling.
It'd be better if we parted.
You always say that, and you always come crawling back.
The best thing would be to kill me like the other.
What other? What other?
Like billions of others.
To every man his little cross. Until he dies. And is forgotten.
Yeah, Laurence James is saying that it's this kid they apparently kill every night. They go into the river and then they retrieve a package for this old lady who asks them if he's turned up yet, and they say he hasn't. She's clearly desperately waiting for Godot to turn up as well. But the way it was written, I found it really compelling, even though none of it really made any sense. The atmosphere was super bleak and engaging. Very sparse descriptions of the environments they're in worked really well. The dialogue was pretty good. I mean, I read it first and then I watched the play and then I read it again. And I feel like they don't quite seem like the same characters to me. Quite often I feel like Estragon is saying things that I think Vladimir would be more likely to say in the story, you know, and vice versa. But I think it works pretty well, and it was an interesting thing to do. And it finally spurred me to go check out Beckett, which I'm really happy about because he's great. Waiting for Godot is great. I know it's like a bit of a cliche or whatever, but like, yeah, it is really good. My mate Will came round the other night and I mentioned to him about watching Waiting for Godot, and he's a big theatre guy, and he insisted we watch a bunch of the really short plays, which were amazing. There's one just called Play, which is 3 people in urns. You can only see their heads, and they're just rambling on to themselves about some sort of bourgeois middle-class drama like infidelity and that sort of thing. There's 2 women and 1 guy, and you can't tell whether they know each other or not. The stuff they're saying sounds like it could be related, like maybe one of the women is the guy's wife and he cheated on her with the other woman, but you just don't know.
He went on and on. I could hear an old hand mower. I stopped him and said that whatever I might feel, I had no silly threats to offer, but not much stomach for her leavings either. He thought that over for a bit. Coughs like a flunky.
When I saw her again, she knew she was looking wretched. Pardon, some fool was cutting grass, a little rush, then another. The problem was how to convince her that no revival of intimacy was involved. I couldn't. I might have known, so I took her in my arms and said I could not go on living without her. I don't believe I could have.
The only solution was to go away together. He swore we should as soon as he had put his affairs in order. In the meantime, he were to carry on as before. By that he meant as best we could.
So he was mine again, all mine. I was happy again. I went about singing the world.
At home, all heart to heart, new leaf and bygones, bygones. I ran into your ex-doxy, she said one night on the pillow. You're well out of that, rather uncalled for, I thought. I am indeed, sweetheart, I said. I am indeed. God, what vermin women. Thanks to you, Angel, I said.
Then I began to smell her off him again, yes.
When he stopped coming, I was prepared, more or less.
Finally, it was all too much. I simply could no longer.
Before I could do anything, he disappeared. That meant she'd won that slut. I couldn't credit it. I lay stricken for weeks. Then I drove over to her place. It was all bolted and barred, all grey with frozen dew on the way back by Ashton, Scotland.
I simply could no longer.
I made a bundle of his things and burnt them. It was November and the bonfire was going all night. I smelt them smouldering.
I'm glad I watched that so soon after watching Waiting for Godot, because there's a bit in Waiting for Godot where Vladimir and Estragon are talking about how they can't stop talking because otherwise they have to think, or they have to listen to the dead voices. And the way they describe the dead voices is amazing. And it has this incredible rhythm to it as well, where it like alternates between Estragon and Vladimir talking about how they sound like leaves and whispers. And yeah, it's great.
You're right. We're inexhaustible.
It's so we won't think.
We have that excuse.
It's so we won't hear.
We have our reasons.
All the dead voices.
They make a noise like wings,
Like leaves.
like sand.
Like leaves.
They all speak together.
Each one to itself.
Rather, they whisper.
They rustle.
They murmur.
They rustle.
What do they say?
They talk about their lives.
To have lived is not enough for them.
They have to talk about it.
To be dead is not enough for them.
It is not sufficient.
They make a noise like feathers,
Like leaves.
like ashes.
Like leaves.
Say something.
I'm seeking.
Or say anything at all.
What do we do now?
Wait for Godot.
Oh, yes.
They say the voices of the dead are just talking about themselves. And that is the play. It's just 3 dead people talking about themselves. I think this might be different on a stage compared to film, but because it's film, the camera pans out occasionally and you see that there's just thousands of these urns with heads chattering away. It's a terrifying vision of the afterlife, right? And it reminded me a bit of like the eternal return, Nietzsche's eternal return. You should live your life as if it's going to repeat over and over again. But instead, Beckett's version is you should live your life as if you're going to be rattling on about it for eternity in an urn. So get some interesting problems to talk about, I guess. But yeah, that was great. Definitely check out Beckett on film. I'm making my way through them now. They're all brilliant. And it's incredibly well cast as well. So that one play, it's got Alan Rickman in, and I can't remember the names of the other 2. They're all famous British actors. Oh, it's Kristen Scott Thomas and Juliet Stevenson. Juliet Stevenson is incredible in it. She really shines. I mean, they're all brilliant. She was the actor I knew the least, and I thought she was the most impressive. All of these short films of Beckett's plays are directed by different directors as well, which is interesting. Yeah, well worth checking out. So yeah, I liked this story a lot. I liked it more the first time I read it before I'd seen Waiting for Godot. though. So if you are a big Beckett fan, I don't know, maybe you wouldn't think much of it. There's a nice little illustration of Estragon and Vladimir here. I quite liked how eerie it was and enigmatic, but obviously it's not at the level of Waiting for Godot. I felt like Waiting for Godot, a lot of it feels like nonsense, but despite that, so many of the lines and the interactions between the characters like remind you of things in real life, of like life experience, and it's like so abstracted. You know, you've got, well, just like the general existentialist stuff, like waiting around for something to happen, like that could apply to so much in life. It can apply to the entirety of life itself. And then like Pozzo and his slave and their relationship is super interesting. They got this real toxic interdependency, and the way Pozzo talks to Vladimir and Estragon as well, because he's like, he sees himself as an upper class kind of guy. Like the bit where they're talking, they first meet him and he's like, "You're on my land," is so good.
I confess, I imagined for a second.
Waiting? So you were waiting for him?
Well, you see...
Here, on my land.
We didn't intend any harm.
We meant well.
The road is free to all.
That's how we looked at
It's
it.
a disgrace. But there you are.
Nothing we can do about it.
Let's say no more about it. Up, pig! Every time he drops, he falls asleep. Up, hog!
And he's desperately trying to make friends with him, I think, but he can't because he's, in his mind, he's elevated himself to the point where he can't converse with anyone properly. He can't like have proper interactions with anyone. He's just ordering his slave around and thinks that's cool. And yeah, the bit where he orders Lucky, the slave, to think, that whole speech is incredible. And I was really glad I had the script to follow along, because it's really hard to follow.
And considering what is more, much more grave, that in the light of the labours lost of Steinweg and Peterman, it appears what is more, much more grave, that in the light of the labours lost of Steinweg and Peterman, that in the plains, in the mountains, by the seas, by the rivers running water, running fire, the air is the same, and then the earth, namely the air, and then the earth, and the great cold, the great dark, the air and the earth, abode of stones, and the great cold, alas, alas, in the year of the Lord 600 and something, the air, the earth, the sea, the earth, abode of stones, and the great cold, the great deeps, on sea, on land, and in the air, I resume, for reasons unknown, in spite of the tennis, the facts are there, but time will tell.
That whole bit is amazing. And in the interview with the cast, the actor who plays Lucky says that the entire play is encapsulated in that speech, which is one of those like fairly glib things to say, which is regardless fascinating to think about. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I reviewed Waiting for Godot there more than and dug the dog a tomb, but it was inevitable due to the nature of the story, I think. Laurence James is an interesting guy. The Science Fiction Encyclopedia says he starts out in science fiction with this story, which is an interesting beginning. And John Clute, or whoever wrote that entry, says it's a science fiction send-up of Waiting for Godot. It's quite interesting thinking of this story in terms of science fiction, because there's no obvious science fictional elements. I mean, that's the case for a lot of the stories in New Worlds. It's more avant-garde literature than science fiction a lot of the time, right? But if you go by the definition of the genre that SF Ultra uses, which I love, where science fiction is when you have characters subjected to an experiment, this definitely falls under that. So yeah, but Laurence James is mainly known for writing a bunch of hyper-violent post-apocalyptic books called Death World. Let me get his article up. I think he's writing under a different name, James Axler, I think. Sorry, not Death World, it's Deathlands, which I think was quite big back in the day. It was like one of those schlocky, violent series of books where they published like hundreds of books with multiple writers, and apparently Jonathan Frakes is going to direct an adaptation of it, which is interesting. I think that's probably on the coattails of the success of Fallout, which, I'm not going to talk about what I think about that show. He wrote the Simon Rack books as well. I haven't heard of any of these. They sound like proper hack writing. People say they're mainly worth checking out because of the violence. If you're into that thing, James Axler is the pseudonym he used when he took over Christopher Lauder in writing the series. And then I think someone else took over from him when he got too sick to write. It, literally churning through entire lifetimes of authors. This series is mad. Big, violent sci-fi hack writer vibes from Laurence James, which interests me, to be honest. I wouldn't mind checking something out by him. I mean, I thought this was well written. So anyway, hell yes. Look at this illustration. The Grain Kings by Keith Roberts is up next. I'm very excited by this. This is a long one, like verging on novella length. So yeah, very interested to see what this is like. Got another cigarette advert. True cigarettes. Of all leading cigarettes, True is the only one that puts its tar and nicotine numbers right on the front of its pack. True has nothing to hide. Desperately trying to fight the negative press. Alright, so The Grain Kings by Keith Roberts is about giant combine harvesters. I'm sure everyone's been dying to read the science fiction story on this topic. A reporter is doing a report on these giant combine harvesters, which are basically like small townships in one huge vehicle, full of engineers, and they even have like multiple bars and restaurants. The food is really nice. The job is quite dangerous and hazardous to your health because of the dust that's created by harvesting all this grain. They're kind of making up for that by giving them lots of luxuries. But yeah, I mean, the story is this journalist doing a report on these combine harvesters, clearly a relatively recent technology. And Keith Roberts names this journalist John Harrison. I can't help but wonder what M. John thought of that, especially considering who the character is. He's constantly thinking about this kind of lost love, I guess. I think he's recently divorced. That's another favourite subject of the new wave. What if everyone was divorced and depressed in the future? John Harrison is, I don't know if it's a recent divorce or not, but it's clearly on his mind, and he's just going through the motions, really. He lies to a colleague that he needs to get some work done to avoid breakfast with them, and then he just goes to his room and has a drink and basically skives off work for a while. It's very convenient for exposition, having the main character a journalist reporting on this technology, right? The story literally opens with him reading a pamphlet. The pamphlet was glossy and well thumbed. Harrison leafed the pages indifferently, glancing up from time to time at a bulkhead clock. The principle of the combine harvester, he read, dates back to the early year of our century. The first machines were crude and small and were usually controlled and operated by one man. See illustration opposite. A UN combine has been likened to a small township on caterpillar tracks. Aboard each great machine, a crew of up to 100 must eat, sleep, work for weeks at a time. The superstructure houses construction and repair shops, generator and boiler rooms, a sick bay, laboratories, a galley, and for off-duty relaxation, a restaurant, television lounge, bars, and a cinema. A modern combine is big. It has to be. It has a big job to do. In Alaska alone, upward of 100,000 square miles of wheat must be harvested in not much more than a month. Wheat is what is needed desperately to feed the teeming millions of our overcrowded planet. So yeah, overpopulation, again, always on people's minds in the 70s. Brave, I think, to open the story with a paragraph of exposition. The story is quite aimless, I'd say, and Harrison, John Harrison, the reporter, is struggling to find a theme to tie his observations together into an interesting article to read, basically. I get the feeling that Keith Roberts had this idea of giant combine harvesters, he was like, right, okay, I'll have a journalist on one of them. That's how we leak out the exposition on the technology and everything. But then he was struggling to think of an actual story to happen. John Harrison is constantly complaining that he can't think of a theme for his article. He doesn't know how to tie it all together. He's taken in all these technical observations and he's thinking, where's the human interest element, you know? Which is what Roberts is doing, for sure. Like, and the story just kind of keeps happening. I wouldn't say it has a plot as such. I think Roberts is trying to portray aimlessness following a sea change in life, you know, like a divorce or whatever. And I think I said this before, where I'm always really impressed when an author can write about boredom or something being boring without the writing being boring. And this is quite similar, you know, writing about aimlessness without the story feeling aimless. And I don't think Roberts quite pulls it off. I think the story does feel aimless to the reader, but I still enjoyed it. And I kept thinking to myself while I was reading it, like, why am I enjoying this? I feel like I shouldn't be enjoying this. Nothing's happening. I mean, not that anything has to happen in the story to make it interesting. And I think that's it. You know, Roberts is just a really good writer. And I think I could read him writing about anything. Like, even when he's writing the technical descriptions of the combine harvester, I'm just like, yeah, the pacing is great. Like, keep going, man. Like, it's wild that he thought this was an interesting thing to write about. He does kind of make it interesting. And so, yeah, Harrison is, it's really long as well. It's like 60 pages, and it's just Harrison getting tours of the combine harvester and drinking on his own, feeling sorry for himself. He's regularly going to the bar and having conversations with the engineers and the barman, who's a Swiss guy called Swissy, which is a choice. And Swissy, I liked Swissy as a character, but all of his dialogue is like phonetic with like a heavy Swiss German accent, which, again, is that the right choice to make? I don't think so. I think phonetic dialogue is rarely a good choice. I always think of John Crowley's Little Big with that, when I was starting to feel iffy about that book about halfway through, and then you get to the part of the book where all of the black New Yorkers are speaking in like pidgin English, and you're like, this is just really racist. I can't really enjoy it anymore. It can ruin a story, I think. It's rarely doing anything other than demeaning the person who's speaking, I think. Like, even if it's lighthearted, it's constantly indicating that they're not on the same level. I don't know. I don't know what it is. I think there are different degrees of doing it as well. You can have like the odd word, just like one word in a sentence, like M instead of them or whatever. Everything else is perfectly spelt English. And just that small change can indicate there's an accent. You don't need everything to be written out that way. But that's how I feel anyway. I think it's distracting. But yeah, Swissy's quite a good character. They're just chatting about anything. Swissy talks all about his life, which, I mean, I've just read this and I can't remember anything that he says. I don't think it's that interesting. A lot of the conversations are just like regular conversations with a vaguely existentialist tone. It rarely feels profound. One of the better conversations is when Harrison goes to talk to the boss, who's this Russian-American guy, Cheskin, who like loves and hates Russia at the same time, and Roberts kind of dwells on that a bit, which is like, is that interesting? I don't know. He goes on a long diatribe about, like, against Harrison's search for poetry in his article about the combine harvesters. Again, I think this is just Roberts writing about how he's writing the story. I think it's quite metafictional in a way. Harrison said, "Don't you approve of poetry, sir?" Cheskin smiled fleetingly. He said, "There is perhaps a poetry, unheard, unsung." He brooded. He said, "No, I have no objection to poetry, but is it necessary to apply the proper labels? Should we know at all times with what we are dealing?" Harrison said, "I'm not quite with you, sir." Cheskin said, "There is your English author, Kipling. You have surely studied his work. He might perhaps render such a theme. He understood much of machines." Harrison said, "I'm afraid I'm no Kipling, sir." Cheskin said, "Perhaps that is as well." He turned the cigarette box thoughtfully in his fingers. He said, "In Kipling's work, the machines are made to speak. They cannot. But the poet is skillful, and so we believe. Soon, too, England speaks, as an old grey mother. The sea speaks to the Danish women, declaring itself a rival for the affections of their men. The little banjo speaks, and what a harmless instrument. So the world, which is as it is, becomes repeopled with mirages and gods. Soon for us stones speak, and trees. We feel the touch of stones and trees, yet we listen to our poets." He rose, stood back, turned, staring down across the miles on miles of wheat. A buzzer sounded on the bridge. Harrison heard the vague pealing of an intercom. Cheskin said, "For me, the grain development areas represent new hope. Here for the first time our many peoples work together, truly together for the universal good. Here, perhaps, if you search, you may find your poetry. This is why none of us must be blinded. We must see very clearly what we do. We must see it as a good thing, perhaps a great thing. But we must find no mystery. Moon and sun do not tug at our brains as they tugged at the brains of earlier men. We reap and we thresh. We are neither gods nor ants. Our machines are our machines. As in this, so in our lives. Our hands work, our will directs the hands. The rest are conceits, our grand words, our luxuries. We cannot permit ourselves such luxuries, Mr. Harrison, if we are to survive. Dreaming we are unaware. From unawareness springs grief, disaster, despair. For our own sakes we must not dream." Harrison said slowly, "I'm sorry if my ideas annoyed you, sir." Yeah, so that's interesting. That kind of, I don't know, reaction against the search for poetic meaning in everything we do, I guess. It's interesting what he says about gods is important as well, because earlier in the story, Harrison looks out on the expanse of wheat beyond the combine harvester and thinks about how they've become the new gods of grain, which feels like a connection to Roberts' The God House. The village in that, they all worship the might be the corn god, I think, but I think this is an interest of Roberts in general. The importance to civilization of food and how it was a sacrosanct thing. But at the same time, it's also just a utilitarian thing. And he likes to explore the spaces between those two perceptions, I guess, which is, yeah, fairly cool. But I guess the main plotty thing that happens in this story is Harrison hooks up with a photographer on the news team who he doesn't know very well. And yeah, there is quite a weird sex scene. It felt fairly problematic to me in the way it was written. I think because Harrison is meant to be quite sympathetic, and consent is not fully there, which is, kind of messed up. I've talked before about the God House, Keith Roberts' story that's in the Chalk Gods, and how that's got some potentially problematic descriptions of sexual assault in, but it's meant to be problematic, you know. It's meant to be, it's bad what's happening. No one could think otherwise reading that, you know. Whereas in this scene, I think it's meant to be like a quite a tender human connection moment. But yeah, there's a weird thing where she's saying don't, and he does it anyway. and then he feels proud of it, which is disgusting, really. I think Roberts does give quite a good portrayal following that of what it's like to, I don't know, like hook up with someone and then have the awkward days afterwards where you have to see each other potentially in a work situation and you don't have maybe the space that is needed and things get awkward, which is, yeah, what happens. And the awkwardness is very much understandable from Alison's perspective, if you consider the shitty thing that Harrison did. But I'm not sure if that's recognized within the story by the author. I really like Roberts as a writer, but I don't think we'd get on. I think he has a very different worldview. I think he's very conservative, and yeah, I'm not. Anyway, yeah, so that happens. They have some more awkward interactions. She comes back to his room again. They're kind of intimate, but it's awkward, and then she leaves, and she's trying to kind of politely distance herself. Then following that, there is like the big thing that happens near the end is the Russians turn up for some reason in Alaska with their big combine harvesters and kind of encroaching on the UN combine harvesters. I don't know if Russia is part of the UN or not. I didn't think too heavily about the politics. I don't think Roberts did, so I didn't feel like I needed to. But there's like a vaguely Cold War thing, you know. There's an accident that occurs and some people die, basically because their combine harvesters came too close to the one that Harrison is on. Roberts then draws a parallel between the combine harvesters crossing paths and having a bit of chaos and then going on their separate way to this tryst between John and Allison. And yeah, it kind of works. Like I said, I enjoyed it because I like Keith Roberts' writing. I probably wouldn't recommend this to anyone. I know it was published a few years after this in Roberts' short story collection titled The Grain Kings. And from what I can see online, it's considered one of the middling stories in that collection, whereas there are a few that are excellent, apparently. So probably still worth tracking down that collection if you're interested in Roberts. Possibly not for this story. I definitely wouldn't track it down for this story alone. Yeah, okay, so that's The Grain Kings. Let's check if I missed anything. I forgot, there's a part where John is frustrated by the lack of knowledge of where this thing with Allison is going, and he says, oh, I should just rape her, or I should have just raped her. And it's really, yeah, it's not okay. And it's not okay. I thought it was vile, and I know what Roberts is doing. He's trying to portray like a super honest interiority where, like, you know, we all have thoughts that we can't control, and some of them are not great. And I understand that. But it kind of comes out of nowhere. It felt quite jarring, really. There's a lot of weird stuff about guns. Allison is fascinated with John's gun in his room, and then he sells his gun to the barman. Fair amount of writing about this gun. And the whole time I'm like, you know, fucking Chekhov, right? Like, when is this going to pop off? And it never does. I think I'm not as interested in Roberts doing romantic writing, especially when he writes stuff like, her legs were delicious. That was a particularly strong line. Or would you mind if I seduced you? Why are so many male authors terrible at writing romance and sex? It's really funny. You pick up like a Tanith Lee book or something, and it's like, fucking hell, this is great. This is amazing. Pick up any of these male new wave authors. It's often terrible. And there's lots of throwaway world building. You know, there's like a UN world government sort of thing, which I think was a pretty optimistic view even in the 70s. I think he does imply that the East Asians dominate the UN somehow. Like, one of the engineers has a weird line where he says, amazing the workings of an oriental mind, referring to like the upper brass of government, which is weird. It's a weird line. It's a weird line. Yeah, Roberts is funny. Yeah, and John is working for World Geographic, That kind of shit, man. No. Nope. That's all I got to say about the Grain Kings. I weirdly enjoyed it, despite all the issues I had with it. I mean, Harrison. Why did he call him John Harrison? Now I just keep thinking M. John Harrison. I mean, that's exactly why he did it. Definitely problematic, aimless, a strange thing to write a story about in all respects, but still weirdly compelling the whole time because he's good at writing. We've got another illustration here for the Grain Kings. That'll be Roberts' illustration himself. So yeah, that's the second Roberts story in the collection. The first one under his real name. I think it was good. Like, it wasn't great. It was good. It was all right. It was a lot better than the earlier story. Which one was that? I Lose Medea. I could be wrong, but I feel like that was published under Alistair Bevan because it was a trunk story, like something he wrote very early on, maybe. Yeah, it felt like reading his dream journal. So then I read Windows by Dann. So Dann and George Zebrowski co-wrote a story in New Worlds Quarterly 2, and in New Worlds Quarterly 3, they have their own stories each, which is cool, because now I get to see what they're like independent of each other. How to talk about this? Kind of crazy. It's a guy, also John, who's stuck in his apartment. There's a lot of bleeding through of ideas, like descriptions suddenly turn into memories or imaginings. Yeah, it's interesting. It's very dreamlike, and I think there's a really fine line that you toe with writing kind of in a dreamlike style, you know. Dreamlike prose, when it's done well, there's not much I like more. Like Anna Kavan's Ice, which is a masterpiece of that kind of writing, where reality is just slightly fluid, characters' identities, and even the sense of time itself, like where you are in history, is changing, but it's still completely engaging and coherent at the same time. It must be so challenging to pull that off, and I'm in awe of Kavan being able to do that to that degree in Ice. And if it goes too much in the way of the surreal, there's not much I hate more than that. I tried reading like a surrealist French book, Froth on the Daydream by Boris Vian, and yeah, I could not get into it. I even tried 2 different translations because I was like, maybe it's the translation. Lots of people say this is good, but when it gets to the degree of like random stuff happening, it's just really off-putting to me, and it loses me very quickly. So yeah, anyway, some really interesting descriptions of the interior of the flat, which disintegrate into his paranoia and anxieties. See if I can find a bit here. John paced the room. If he stopped, he would sink into the multicolored carpet of translucent mud or heated plastic, greens, golds, ochres flecked with blue thread, puddles of vermilion rippling against a sand border of copper, drenched, glistening with his sweat. At eye level, his prints, overlaid with gummed plastic, steamed inside their penny frames. Pausing at the open window, John gazed at the silhouette skyline of the grey buildings. The room bulged with new mass seeping in from the outside. John turned from the window and walked to the opposite wall. 1,000 faces gelled out of the dampness and then blanched, leaving only a few lines of pink ooze in their wake. You see what I mean? And I think some of that works and some of it doesn't. I think it's a bit too much, you know? He's got the dial turned up too high. And he's in his 20s writing this, so that's fully understandable. I assume he developed this more as he kind of grew as a writer. He leaves the apartment and walks around the New York streets, like Broadway, and goes to the Keys. And he's having these like paranoid delusions about everyone he walks past. He's called John, but he thinks everyone keeps calling him Richard. He's getting really freaked out about that. And then in Central Park, he comes across a rape and murder of a woman. The perpetrators run off as he approaches, and then reflected in her dying eyes, he sees the crime take place, which then merges into his own paranoid delusions. There's a lot of stuff about him being like a repressed homosexual, which is a weird concept, right? I think it was very popular around this time. It comes up with Barry Malzberg quite a lot, and I've read something by Harlan Ellison mentioning it. It's a Freudian thing, isn't it? And they're all really into Freud. Psychoanalysis. The reason you're acting irrationally is because you're suppressing these sexual urges or whatever. I think that's like been fairly debunked now. It sounds like bullshit anyway. Not to say that there aren't people whose sexuality isn't oppressed or suppressed, you know, in like conservative, very religious families, maybe people getting sent to conversion camps, that sort of thing. There can be an element of self-repression there where the person in question is convinced that these feelings are wrong when they're not. But I think this Freudian idea of the repressed homosexual is bullshit. There are bullshit ideas in general that are still interesting to think about, especially when they turn up in fiction and they can be woven into a story in an interesting way. I don't think this is one of them. Like, I don't think it's interesting as an idea of psychology, even knowing that there's nothing to it in reality. So yeah, and then he goes on a murder spree, steals a cop's gun, starts killing people. He sees like this vision of like a traditional family Christmas in a country home. He starts shooting people that fit into the roles of that dream. Like the policeman himself is the dad, and then he shoots a woman who's the mother, and then some kids who are the kids in the dream. It's wild. And like parts of that I thought were quite cool. It's horrible, but it was interesting. And similarly to like watching what happened to the woman, or what potentially happened to her, what he imagined happening to her in her eyes as she dies, that's a really cool image. And there's another thing later where he's really losing it. He starts imagining everyone being reflected in everyone else's eyes and multiplying, and it does have this suffocating feeling. There was a lot of the story I thought was cool. There was a lot that I thought didn't work as well. But that's what like New World is for, isn't it? It's trying stuff out. And he's in his 20s, you know. It's better than anything I could do. Again, it's not one I would recommend. I'm not sure if I'd say I enjoyed it, but I found it interesting to think about, which is the main thing I'm after with reading in general. Stuff doesn't have to be perfect. It's like, you know, there's that obsession with polish. It's very obvious with like movies and games, where so much attention is put into the polish of the product, you know, how it looks, because you know, sight just is immediately understood. You don't have to think about it. You just receive the image, right? So if it looks attractive in some way, that immediately gets you off to a good foot. So they just put loads of effort into making everything look great, even though that's arguable. I think like even lots of CGI these days has gone downhill compared to like 10, 15 years ago. But you know what I mean, like the sheen, the gloss. You play a AAA game and it's like, oh wow, like I can see the blades of grass waving in the wind in Red Dead Redemption or whatever. And like, it's probably a bad example because that game's actually alright. A lot of the time, there's more effort put into how stuff kind of immediately looks compared to the actual substance of it. I think it gets to the point where some people get so used to that they won't accept anything that's less. They can't watch a movie that's in standard definition or filmed on a shitty camera. And I think it applies to acting as well. People expect this very high quality of acting and direction that you only get with like huge budgets. And if you're only able to watch stuff like that, then you're missing out on so much. All the low budget, like indie stuff, like properly indie, like someone with a camcorder just having a go, like making a horror flick, and it's good. Like the acting might not be great, the production values are terrible, but it's still scary or interesting or fun or whatever. Horror really lends itself to that, right? Because of the whole like found footage thing. Hey, it's the version of me that's doing the editing. I cannot believe I didn't mention Unfeatured Films here. If you are interested in found footage horror at all, or horror films in general, go check out Unfeatured Films on YouTube. His video on found footage horror is excellent. He really knows what he's talking about, so definitely worth checking out if that's your thing. Anyway, I'll hand you back to past me. I think there's something similar going on with books. I read Tanith Lee's The Electric Forest recently, which I loved. It's such a good book. And it's so short as well. Just like you bang out in a couple of days. Her writing is incredible. And I saw this Goodreads review. And hey, Goodreads, we all know, is this bastion of great literary criticism. But unfortunately, I found this stupid review, which was this guy who was saying, like, the writing is overwrought, it's messy, it's all over the place. He quoted one line from the book, which was a bit clunky, and is like, look at how bad this is. And loads of people underneath are going like, oh yeah, that sentence is a mess. Jesus Christ, editor should have caught that. It's like, yeah, that's the point. The editing was probably rushed because they're these small paperbacks that are just churning out. Nevertheless, you have like geniuses like Tanith Lee or Barry Malzberg churning out amazing like art. Despite the conditions around them, you're going to have more typos or like sentences maybe should have been rearranged or whatever. But overall, like, the writing is there's so much more to it than like, a random contemporary science fiction or fantasy book you'd pick up, which all feel like they're just written to be optioned as like a Netflix movie. Anyway, I think what I'm trying to say is that reading imperfect fiction is still really interesting, and sometimes it can be more interesting than something which is got no imperfections, because stuff with no imperfections can sometimes also have no substance. I don't know. I feel like my grand thesis is collapsing under its own weight, but maybe I made some sense there. The last one I read was A Cleansing of the System by Charles Platt. This shouldn't take long. This was terrible. This is really bad. I was interested in reading some Charles Platt because he becomes involved with the editorial team. If he's not already, I don't think he is at this point in New Worlds. He co-edits, I think, New Worlds 5. Oh no, I can see it on my shelf. It's New Worlds 6 with Moorcock. And then Hilairy Bayley takes over. So Platt is like the interim editor of New Worlds during that changeover. So yeah, I was interested in what his writing was like. And Jesus Christ, I have a really bad memory. So that does make me prone to hyperbole. But I'm really struggling to think of a short story that was worse than this. It was so bad. And it started off quite well. It's got like a setting the scene opening, which is fairly engaging. Walter was the custodian. His cubicle was down near the heart of the city. Each night he would undress and lie naked on his airbed. Each night the ceiling would dim out. The heartbeats thudding gently beneath the plastic floor of the little room would lull him to sleep, and each night the city's lungs, gasping and sighing like waves on a distant shore, wafting air up from below levels to the Astrodome and down again, would set a rhythm for Walter's own breathing. I think that's a pretty strong opening. And then the longer the story goes on, the more it just completely falls apart. Extremely golden age in style. Cities have become like mobile, autonomous machines. They can move, they move around, they collect resources, and people live lives of luxury. This particular city is one for artists, so it's filled with artists. We don't get any description of the art they're doing. Charles Platt doesn't care about the art. All he's interested in is talking about how they're all hopped up on this new drug. The city's moving. Walter, the custodian, who hates the artists, thinks of them as like messy children, basically, is trying to figure out why. He gets this guy, Isaac, to help him, who's the only rational man in the city. Fucking hell. Just happens to be a woman in his flat. She's new to the city, so she can serve as female non-character ego mirror who just asks relevant questions at certain times so that needed exposition can be given to the reader, and has absolutely no personality. That's one of my least favourite misogynistic tropes in Golden Age SF. Awful. They find a bunch of hobos, literally called hobos, in the below levels of the city. They're distilling loads of alcohol and giving it to the artists. That's the new drug they're all crazy about. And then they just shove all the hobos into a glass ball and throw them in the ocean. That's it. That's the story. He had the idea of these cities, and he's like, fuck, I have no idea. No idea what to do with this. He has some like half-assed world building where you can only live in the cities when you're middle-aged, and the old and the young live in harmony with nature, which has retaken the land. But these old guys, these hobos are old guys. They're not living by those rules. They glowered at him, clenching their knobbly fists. They were stooped, bearded, dressed in blankets, undergarments, seat covers, pieces of utility work clothes, stitched crudely together. One wore a makeshift pair of spectacles, twisted wire frames supporting transparent plastic bottoms punched out of a couple of soft drink bottles. Like the rest of them, he was emaciated, almost totally bald. "Hobos," said Walter. "Uh-huh, hobos we," said the one with the spectacles. His face twitched in a brief spasm. He spat on the floor, and Walter glanced at the gob of spittle with mild disgust. "Wipe that up." The oldster glared at him. "Wipe it up!" Sorry, so bad. Yeah, and I've got to read the end so you understand. It just fizzles out. After they'd gone, Walter sat in silence a while. "It's a lonely life being custodian," he said at length. "It is? Those artists don't realize how easy they got it. No responsibilities, the system looks after them. That's true. They don't understand. Someone has to do the job to protect their interests. I know how you feel. You're a good friend, Isaac. I do my best, Walter." Walter stood up. "I think maybe I'll go to my cubicle and watch a tape." "All right." He paused by the transit tube. "Thanks for helping out, Isaac. I mean, I really appreciated it. It was nothing." "Yeah, well, maybe see you tomorrow." "I expect so." And then there's just a couple more sentences about how he's chilling out in his room. That's some of the worst writing I've ever read. It's awful, and the conservative, anti-welfare tone of it can fuck off. All right, so Charles Platt sucks, and we know that now. Oh, and great. Next up is John Sladek, my favourite writer. The Purloined Butter. Great. Thankfully, it's only a few pages. And then we got a Christopher Priest story, which I'm really excited to read. So, yeah, okay. I'll get back to you in a minute. When I first beheld, with horror and loathing, Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Purloined Letter, I knew that no course lay open before me but protest in print. I cannot go to court to prove that Mr. Poe, as he chooses to call himself, purloined my story, yet the disguised title, the alteration of the subject from one of some dignity, butter, to the ludicrous and no doubt, as Mr. Poe still sees it, satirical epithet, letter. These can never deceive those readers who have taken pleasure in many of my other tales, such as The Gold Bag, Cask of the Red Death, Fall of the Hose of Usher. Through the padding and distortion with which Mr. Poe, even yet, seeks to puff my little tale into a great mystery, the original shines through. I say no more. My story is here to speak for itself. John Sladek. I hate this shit, man. Like, this wink of the eye, tongue-in-cheek, this awful sense of humour. You know, if you've seen any of my other videos, you probably know I don't like John Sladek. I feel like I'm the only person in the world with that opinion. If you go online and you just see the endless praise for him, I still think that maybe I've just read the wrong stories. But it's quite a few now. I think I've read 5 of his short stories, and I've hated every single one. Maybe one I just disliked. So there's a bit of a range there. Anyway, so straight off the bat, Sladek is saying he's doing a Poe thing. He's doing a take on the Purloined Letter. So I picked up my Edgar Allan Poe short story collection. Tales of Mystery and Imagination. I usually dislike Wordsworth classics greatly. Let's pick this up in a charity shop, but this one's pretty good. Often their books have like the tiniest print imaginable. Like I'm not at the age yet where I need reading glasses, although I can't be far off at this point. But yeah, some of their books you open and you're like, I need a need a magnifying glass or something, like. But this is fine. I also quite like that to save space, they just have the story like start in the middle of the page. I think that's cool. I like it. So yeah, I read The Purloined Letter by Edgar Allan Poe, and yeah, I loved this. I thought it was great. I was really excited to find out it's an Auguste Dupin story because I haven't read any of them yet, but I've been interested in doing so for a while now, since I read Death of the Compass by Borges, which, if you don't know, Jorge Luis Borges, I hope I'm saying that right, wrote this story, Death of the Compass, which is like a parody of the detective story. And he even mentions Auguste Dupin by name at the beginning. He says, I can't remember the name of the character in Death of the Compass. Is it Lostron? Something like that. But the story opens by saying that character is a real Auguste Dupin. And because I'm an idiot and I'm not well read, I was like, who? And yeah, Auguste Dupin was Edgar Allan Poe's detective character. Lonrot. Is that what I said? Lunrot, I guess. It's got the umlaut. Yeah, it's a good story. I've heard it described as like an inverse of a detective story where the detective gets like sucked into the complicated patterns of the case, and his faith in abstract reasoning and trying to decipher these Kabbalistic patterns that are appearing leads him to his doom, which is, yeah, it's great fun. But I was surprised by The Purloined Letter because I thought, I'm going to get one of those original detective stories, right? Edgar Allan Poe is often cited as inventing the detective story. I think any Wilkie Collins fans out there may disagree. I think there's a third guy as well who's potentially got that title, the Michael Collins of the group. It's a NASA joke for you. Yeah, so I was surprised at how much The Purloined Letter seemed to be taking the piss out of detective fiction. One of the things I like about the new wave is their slightly pretentious use of literary influences, but like wearing them on their sleeves. You know, they'll put the epigraphs at the front of the stories. They'll point you towards their influences, which I like because I'm a dumb guy. I like to have these things signposted. So I go and read, you know, the good literary shit after being pointed in the right direction by these guys. I'm starting to see now why John Sladek and Tom Disch, who were two big new wave science fiction guys in the 70s, were really into Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, Tom Disch and Charles Naylor's anthology Strangeness, which I reviewed in another video, is all centered around Poe's influence, but maybe his not so obvious influences. I think that short story collection is basically looking at the Gothic, but without the obvious aesthetics of the genre, which is pretty cool. But I'm starting to get why they're into him now, because he's writing genre fiction, you know, popular fiction. It's fun and easy to read. But he's also got like quotes from Seneca in the original Latin at the beginning. Nil sapientiae odiosius acumine nimio, which is something about cleverness. Nothing is more hateful to wisdom than excessive cleverness. There you go. Which is a great quote to put at the top of the story, because Auguste Dupin is excessively clever throughout the whole thing. And it's ridiculous. The whole story is ridiculous. So the prefect of the Parisian police turns up, Monsieur G, and with a case for Auguste Dupin. And this is feeling already a lot like Sherlock Holmes, right? You can see the influence. It's like Lestrade turning up at Baker Street or whatever. And the narrator is Dupin's friend, who's like describing the conversations they're having in the sitting room while smoking pipes. This is the same format that William Hope Hodgson uses for his Karnaki the Ghost Finder stories, which I have somewhere. Yeah, here, with this wild cover. There's a weird little guy and a pig. I've read a couple of these and they're yeah, they're good fun. It's just occult detective fiction, which when I first encountered that, I thought this is a niche genre, and then it turns out no, it's not. It's huge. There are endless examples of occult detective fiction, and in fact, going all the way back to Auguste Dupin, like a lot of his stories are kind of spooky stories, I think, which makes sense because it's Poe. Okay, I just checked, and what I said there was not quite right. Dupin doesn't actually investigate any supernatural phenomena himself, but he was an important precursor to the occult detective, teeing up Hodgson's Carnacki and Algernon Blackwood's John Silence, Dr. John Silence as well. That's such a great name, which appeared in the early 1900s. It's like quite a fair bit later. When was the Purloined letter published? 1844. It's mad how early Poe was writing this stuff, and it didn't seem to catch on until like much later, or people didn't seem to kind of think about aping it. Yeah, or maybe they did. I don't know. I think a lot of it was to do with the market, popular fiction being more financially viable because of printing costs and stuff. So like genre fiction had to wait for that to happen before it could kick off. This one isn't spooky. The case is a royal lady. Did France still have royalty while Poe was writing? Like they'd had the revolution, but did they bring back the they brought them back, didn't they? I listened to all of Mike Duncan's episodes on this, but I've forgotten it all. When did France last have a monarchy? It ended definitively in 1870. That's so late. Yeah, that's mad. It was abolished between 1792 and 1804, and then it was the Bourbon Restoration in 1814 to 1830, and then the July monarchy. Man, there's nothing more complicated than French Revolutionary history. Okay, that's mad. So yeah, when Poe was writing, there was a French royal family. So yeah, royal, like they don't say princess, but it's definitely a princess, has misplaced a controversial letter which a minister kind of slyly stole off her, which could be used for blackmail of some high degree. She's offered a sizable reward for the prefect to find the letter for her, and she knows that this minister has it, and he's hiding it somewhere. The prefect has snuck into this guy's house every night and searched everywhere and can't find the letter. This is where it starts to feel like satire, because the extent to which they search for this letter in the minister's house is ridiculous. They're like taking apart all the furniture, they're looking under all the wallpaper, they're measuring the thickness of the covers of the books to make sure something hasn't been sewn inside. It's clearly impossible. I think Poe is having a laugh at the certainty of some of this deductive reasoning, right? The idea that you can say all avenues have been exhausted in one area is impossible, and it's ridiculous to say that. A lot of the story is dedicated to this ridiculous search. And then the prefect leaves, and there's a lot of chatting about how to suss people out. He talks about like a schoolboy winning all the marbles of a game of like guessing whether the number in your hand is odd or even by judging how intelligent his opponent is. And so Auguste Dupin is trying to do the same thing for Minister D, who's the guy that's got the letter. There's quite a long ramble about mathematics and poetry. Dupin is like, if the minister was only a mathematician, I wouldn't put any faith in his reasoning. But since he's a poet as well, we're dealing with a smart cookie, which really reminded me of like, I don't know, how I felt throughout my life up until my teenage years. Like science was my thing. I was really into science. Thought it was super interesting. This is how the world works and the universe and the human body and everything else. As time's gone on, I felt like that's just the low-hanging fruit, these kind of facts. And, there's the philosophy of scientific thought to go along with it. But Empiricism's quite dry. And I've been thinking it's the humanities where it's at, or philosophy in general, social studies, or just art. That's where the really interesting stuff is going on, because there's not this there is no certainty in science, but it has the air of certainty, It's very reductionist. You're honing down the theory, right? Whereas with art, you're trying to expand and go in as many directions at once, and I just find that more fascinating in general. Japan seems to be in that area with his ramble. While I was thinking about this, I noticed that there's a parallel between the change in my interests that I just talked about and the movement of science fiction from the golden age to the new wave, where it's like, as a genre, the new wave is rejecting the obviousness of hard science, particularly like the physical sciences, and delving into more of the social sciences, psychology, and philosophy in general, and just art and literature. And I think that's why I like it so much. I like what they're trying to do, even though I don't like all new wave fiction, right? But I like the ethos of it, And Japan complains about how people confuse pure mathematics with reality when they're not the same thing at all, which is a really interesting question, right? That is maths discovered or invented? Personally, I think it's invented. The patterns are really there, but we make our own language to try and understand it, is my limited understanding of that anyway. But yeah, it's interesting. There's interesting ideas talked about in here. Like it has that feeling of reading like a new wave science fiction story in a way. Like it was written in the mid 19th century or early 19th century or whatever, which is, yeah, it's cool. I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed the story. And Dupin, he obviously figures it out and gets the letter, gets a sizable amount of the reward for himself. And there's a weird thing where he's kind of going and chatting to the minister, and they clearly know each other, but he's just known as Minister D. It turns out the minister is hiding the letter in plain sight, making it so obvious that the police wouldn't think to look in that particular place. Dupin swaps the real letter for a fake one and leaves a clue for Minister D in there, which is a quote in French, and that means, "If such a sinister design is not worthy of Atreus, it is worthy of Thyestes," which is a reference to Crébillon's Atre et Thyeste, which is a tragedy about Atreus and Thyestes, who are brothers. So there's a theory that Minister D is actually Dupin's brother, and that's why he knows him so well, and he's able to just turn up at his apartment and have random conversations with him while he's swapping out the letter. I didn't know what this French tragedy was. I don't speak French. So that went over my head, but super interesting, right? And just cool to read something that's clearly had a huge influence on genre fiction in general, but like detective fiction specifically, that feels like a parody of itself. I feel like this often happens, right? You assume parodies, the reversals, they all come much later when people are riffing off the old stuff. And then you go back to the original thing and it's like, they were doing this stuff straight away, Edgar Allan Poe was parodying himself immediately. Or maybe he's parodying Wilkie Collins, I don't know. I found that interesting, especially considering Death of the Compass being this kind of inverse parody of Auguste Dupin, which is already quite a bit in that direction. So yeah, I really enjoyed that, and I'm excited to read more Dupin stories. There's quite a few in there, I think, which is great. And then I read Sladek's story, The Purloined Butter. Are you surprised that I hated it? I'm not. Yeah, all it is it's basically the conversation between Dupin and the prefect talking about this ridiculous search, which he's copied and pasted in its entirety, and then just changed the word letter to butter. This is very smart, you can tell. And then the conversation changes when Dupin starts talking about how many hours, how many men the prefect would require to do the search, and does these like back of the fact packet calculations to show that it's patently ridiculous, which is already obvious in the original story. He uses that to deduce that the prefect has the butter on him. I feel like Sladek thinks he's being real clever here. The original story is obviously ridiculous. That whole discussion about the search is meant to be funny because it's impossible. And then Sladek's like, oh, I'm gonna point out the joke, and that's gonna be my take on it. It's crap. Like, it's like, yeah, the more I read of Sladek, the more I'm just like, why is there so much praise for him? I think I've just been really unlucky in the stories I've read. He wrote a couple of mysteries himself, actually, and they're well reviewed, as well as Gothic novels under the pseudonym Cassandra Nye, which he shared with Tom Disch, which is interesting. I'm sure there's something out there, like he's got those robot books, Roderick, which is meant to be like, I think it's meant to be a take on Candide. But yeah, if it's anything like this, I just can't be asked, you know? I'll just go and read Voltaire instead of John Sladek's like, oh, you know this kind of funny bit in Voltaire? Well, it's funny because of this. I don't give a shit. Yeah, I need to stop talking about it. Bizarre. Next is The Head and the Hand, Christopher Priest. I am very excited to read Christopher Priest. I love Christopher Priest. I mean, I've only read The Inverted World, which I thought was amazing. Most of what he's written sounds great. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this. And then 2 more after that, so 3 to go before the acerbic M. John Harrison essay in the back. So yeah, let's see how that goes. Okay, strong story from Christopher Priest there. Yeah, really enjoyed that. It's made me really excited to read The Prestige. It kind of, I feel like it prefigures a lot of that stuff. It's got a lot of like showmanship in and stage performance related activity. I don't want to talk too much about this one because I really enjoyed the experience of reading it blind. It's got 2 acts, roughly. The first act is introducing you to the setting, kind of drip feeding you information in that style that is really common to particularly vintage science fiction stories. It's still modern ones now, I'm sure. I just haven't read that many. Potentially short fiction of most genres, where you're being drip fed information and you're trying to figure out what's going on. What is this story about? Which sometimes I feel like that is what can put people off short stories, right? Because it's an uncomfortable experience. It's disorientating. You don't know where you are, what's going on. Whereas with a novel, that can happen at the start, and then very quickly you get a handle on the world and the scenario, whatever. Whereas a short story is often mostly taken up by that, like just trying to figure out what is this about, you know? There are different ways of doing that, I think, that I've come across anyway. There's the slowly revealing information that the reader can compile to try and speculate as to what's actually happening. And then there's the style of someone like James Tiptree Jr., sometimes Joanna Russ, where it's very like hallucinatory, stream of consciousness, almost quite like abstracted prose that is just difficult to tell what's going on full stop, you know. I quite enjoy that. It's something that attracts me to short fiction, I think. And it's a taste I've developed, I think. I don't think I was into it massively at first. But yeah, this was really good. Feels like it's set in the 19th century or early 20th century. Could be later, but it's got that aesthetic. The story opens on like a country manor house outside Paris. And the main character is the butler for this wealthy guy who they were once acquaintances on a similar level, but now the wealthy guy's career has elevated him to a station far above the main character. So there's this distance, and he's having an affair with his boss's wife. And there's something strange going on with the boss, but it's not immediately clear what that is. Very cool little like hints throughout as to what it might be. And then in the second half, it explains what has led to this situation. And then you get the final show of this performer. The performer / boss's name is Todd. And his type of show, it isn't the same thing as this, but it really reminded me of that French entertainer, Mr. Mangetout, who I only found out about a little while ago. He ate all kinds of inanimate objects, so like Mangetout eat all. Let me get a list of what he actually ate. It's on the Wikipedia. So Mr. Mangetout allegedly consumed 45 door hinges, 18 bicycles, 15 shopping carts, 10 television sets, 6 chandeliers, 2 beds, 1 pair of skis, a computer, a copy of the textbook Gravitation by Misner, Thorne and Wheeler, 1 Cessna 150 light aircraft. I think that was his pièce de résistance, 1 waterbed, 500 meters of steel chain, 1 coffin with handles, 1 Guinness World Records Award plaque. Yeah, he got given a Guinness World Records Award and he ate the award. And assorted razors and bolts. You can look up videos of him eating some of this stuff. It's pretty hard to watch. Although, most of it he breaks up into very small pieces and like downs with mineral oil and water. Apparently he could eat up to nearly 1 kilogram of metal per day. Kind of amazing he didn't destroy his digestive system. Apparently it took him 2 years to eat the plane. Yeah, which is pretty impressive. Apparently he suffered no ill effects from eating all this stuff. But then it also just says in 2006 he died of natural causes at 55. I don't know many natural causes that kill people at 55. Maybe eating all that stuff had an effect there. But anyway, it just reminded me of that. This kind of mad novelty, somewhat transgressive performance. I mean, it's more transgressive in the story. Michel Lotito, Mr. Mangetout, apparently had a disorder known as pica, which is characterized by an appetite for indigestible material. Yeah, and got started because he broke a glass in his mouth as a kid and enjoyed eating it, I think. So yeah, kind of mad, but obviously, made an entire career out of this, and people can't help themselves, like it's fascinating to watch something so weird, and that is partly what the story is about. It's about that kind of, prurience of the audience watching something bizarre, but also the irresistible pull on the entertainer themselves to keep doing these performances even when it's causing them harm. But yeah, really enjoyed it. Incredibly well written and very readable. The only novel I've read by Priest is The Inverted World, which I really enjoyed. It felt quite like Borgesian in a lot of ways. Like if Borges ever wrote a novel, I don't think he wrote a novel. If he ever wrote a novel, then Inverted World could be it, It felt very much like kind of like allegorical SF or working through a thought experiment, and I really enjoyed it. And apparently that's at the middle of his career, and everything before is a bit more traditionally SF, although new wave SF. Everything after, from the Affirmation onwards, I think, he adopts his own kind of style, which sounds like it's quite magical realist, but I haven't read any of that yet. I'm quite interested in reading outward from The Inverted World, like alternating one book before, one book after. Yeah, really interesting author. Excited to read more of him. Definitely read that story, The Head and the Hand. Really good. And there's a cool illustration of a swan caught in some telephone wires. So then I read The History Machine by George Zebrowski, which starts with these like logic statements in these boxes, which are they're just paradoxes. So the statement in this box is false, The statement in this box is false only if it is true. It also ends with one. Infinite regress, a form of irrationality, a strong objection to the validity of a line of reasoning, usually used to dismiss as nonsense any assertion or class of assertions which lead to an infinite regress. I really like this story. I think it could have done without these boxes. I think they took away from it, really. Just made it a bit kind of hokey. And it felt like they were explaining the theme of the story a bit too strongly. I got it from the story. I didn't need these paradoxes to be thrown at me to kind of understand the absurdity of the story. It starts off in the style of like quite an abstrusely written treatise on the nature of reality as divided between the internal psychological and the external world of atoms. You know, at the center of the story is this device called the history machine, which this character is using to record every single detail of his life. It's also possible for the machine to, through analysis of the deterministic physics of the universe, determine pretty much everything that's happened in the past anywhere, which is, of course, absurd, but an interesting thought experiment. That idea I've come across before in the Arthur C. Clarke book, Childhood's End. One of the pieces of technology the aliens give to humans is a device that can show them any period of history they want, anywhere. But it's censored, which I always like that detail. The aliens didn't trust humans to see certain elements of their own history, which I think is related to what happens at the end. But that's a pretty good book. Arthur C. Clarke is where I started out with science fiction. He didn't write the kind of stuff I would be massively into now, but I did really enjoy that book when I was like 10. I feel like I would still enjoy it now. The story moves from this kind of philosophizing about reality into the details on how this guy is recording everything and how he's obsessed with recording everything. He just has a couple of little drips of information, like there are only a few types of people that can have a history machine, either historians, heads of state, or the police, which is like a terrifying prospect, right? The police and heads of state being able to see any detail about anything or about anyone, which it doesn't feel too far off our current reality if they put enough resources in. I'm sure GCHQ have my video running through their system right now. It's not paranoia if it's really happening. The rest of the story really reminded me of that Brian Aldiss story in Strangeness, where the lines converge, where that guy is holed up in his house and obsessively recording himself and observing himself through cameras. Some of the descriptions here of the character who's unnamed, I think, who is obsessively watching old recordings of himself, watching old recordings of his life, sometimes watching recordings of history, which like almost goes too far into the kind of the infinite regress thing to the point where it feels a bit silly, but I think he pulls it off, and it's meant to be absurd, you know. I'll just read a bit to give an idea. The mushroom of a Nagasaki was beautiful on the screen, on the wall. Those vibrations were still etched sharply into the fabric of eternity, and most good history machines could still pick them up well. Deep red washes of colour like light playing on the open wound guts of a disemboweled man. I leaned forward to see how many mushrooms there were in the regression of screens on the wall. Most of my other selves leaned forward, except one. I have always preferred the Nagasaki mushroom to the one at Hiroshima. That's a great line. There were a few faint faces in the picture, repeated within themselves again and again to the vanishing point. Expressionless faces. I never knew when they would appear, these quirks on the continuum of fluttering reality. I knew a few historians who specialized in them, but they were more like artists than historians. I have learned to ignore the faces. I think that's pretty fucking cool. And the faces, kind of the hints of faces you can see. I don't know exactly what he's saying there, but I couldn't help but feel like, cause I think he's watching a video of the US bombing of Nagasaki, and I wondered if it's like hinting to the fact that it's the reflection of his face in that screen, and So he's seeing all of these faces that are the reflections of himself watching those old recordings, which he's choosing to ignore. He doesn't want to see himself looking back at himself. It could be someone else, but I thought that was really cool thinking of it that way. There's also a really sad part where he's watching himself have sex with his wife, who's been dead for 8 years. Yeah, the stories from Jack Dann and George Zebrowski I've been pretty impressed by in this collection. Like, the Dann one was a bit of a mess, but like, it was interesting enough that I'm willing to forgive that. And yeah, I thought this story was cool. This is the sort of story I'm kind of expecting picking up in New Worlds, like something weird, interesting writing style, a bit dark, you know. Yeah, so I can't really complain there. That was great. So two good stories in a row there. I'm starting to forget the John Sladek one. That's it's being wiped from my mind. All right, so the Chronicle of Blackton by Hilairy Bayley. It's a cool illustration there of a wolf and a castle. This is the last story, and then we're on to an M. John Harrison essay, which I always love. So yeah, all right, let's see what they're like. First off, this is a little bit embarrassing, but I thought Hilairy Bayley was a guy. I don't know where I got that from. I think I'm just being an idiot. It seems like a particularly stupid mistake to make because Hilairy is often a woman's name, but there is an old English tradition of it being a man's name as well. And I think, you know, there aren't many women involved in New Worlds, so yeah, you'll have to forgive me for making that assumption. And yeah, I apologize if I misgendered her in the past. I think I probably did. Quite like this story. I thought it was good for the most part. It's a horror story, which is a great note to finish the collection on, I think. I guess you could call it post-apocalyptic gothic, which is interesting because one of the only things I know about Hilairy Bayley, besides being the future, you know, or the later editor of New Worlds after Moorcock, is that she had a discussion with M. John Harrison about the Gothic as political fiction, which inspired him to write Running Down, which is an amazing story. And this is definitely the Gothic as political fiction, prefiguring Running Down, which is cool. M. John Harrison does it better. Not really any surprise there, but yeah, I did enjoy this. The writing's pretty good, particularly in the first half where Bayley is setting the scene, and it's got a strong vibe. You know, it's very Gothic. There's a creepy castle, some dark woods with howling beasts, and the peasant villagers live in fear of the oppressive lords. The opening is actually amazing. It starts with a hunt and has this like very effusive, grandiose description of the lord in his hunting gear, and he's got these beautiful golden locks and all of the accoutrements associated with that sort of activity. And the next scene is just him offering a human heart to the lady, who bites into it straight away. It's also a vampire story, really, like loosely. The lord and lady are cannibals, as are their children, and they hunt the villagers. They also play these cruel, twisted games with their servants, which end in one or more of them getting eaten pretty reliably. Those parts were great. Really enjoyed those weird games they were playing in the castle, and the early descriptions of the workers in the village. Most of them are miners, I think, so it definitely had a, north of England, South Wales coal miner vibe. Tensions were running high in the 70s in that regard. And then the story shifts a little bit, and we're introduced to a bunch of angels looking down on what's happening below. And all of the angels are revolutionary figures or socialist historical figures. Like there's Garibaldi and Louis Franck, Lord Shaftesbury, Angel Barry, who it took me a while to figure out that that's Tom Barry, the Irish revolutionary. Hardy, Keir Hardy, the founder of the UK Labour Party, who is turning in his grave. over what they've become. Toussaint Louverture, who is the leader of the Haitian Revolution, which is an extremely interesting revolution. Highly recommend. I think I recommend him almost every video I make. But Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast is great, and his episodes on the Haitian Revolution are fascinating. So yeah, that marks a turn in the tone of the story for sure. And I'm not sure if it's for the better. I was happy to go along with it. I mean, it feels quite like a Barry Malzberg thing to do. He likes to have like the ghosts of famous historical figures just turn up and berate a character, particularly JFK. Yeah, it just seemed a bit like none of them had any personality really. You know, they were just, the names were popping up and they could have been interchangeable. They were just all saying in quite clipped terms that they weren't happy about the oppression below. And then there's a bunch of stuff that happens, and there's a rebellion, and you can probably guess the rest. I certainly could. And so that definitely took the enjoyment out of the last third or so of the story for me. It felt pretty predictable, but there was a lot in that I enjoyed. I would say it's good overall. So yeah, quite interested to read more Hilairy Bayley. And yeah, the Gothic as political fiction is just a great idea, really cool. And then I read The Black Glak by M. John Harrison. It's a critical essay. I love these critical essays from Harrison. They're always a real treat to finish off the collection with. This one was fairly focused on just absolutely destroying Colin Wilson, which made it an extremely fun read. He's got a lot of nice things to say about this guy, Harvey Jacobs, who I've never heard of, but that's not entirely surprising because I feel like I haven't heard of most people. But that's partly why I'm reading these collections. It's flash exposure to loads of authors. It's interesting because Harrison talks about how he's writing humorous stories, and then mentions Jack Trevor's Story and Angus Wilson as well, who were... Jack Trevor's Story wrote mostly mystery, I think, and mystery crime. And Angus Wilson was a literary writer, I think. Let me check. Yeah, an English novelist and short story writer. He was the first openly gay English writer, which is cool. And oh shit, he worked at Bletchley Park with Alan Turing, translating Italian naval codes. This guy sounds interesting. He was instrumental in getting Colin Wilson's first novel published in 1956, and from 1957 he gave lectures further afield in Japan, Switzerland, Australia, and USA. That's mad. So, loops back round to Colin Wilson. M. John Harrison is saying we should have more writing like Angus Wilson, but we have Angus Wilson to blame for Colin Wilson. All these guys sound pretty cool. I mean, anyone that M. John Harrison says is good, I'm willing to check out. It's probably fairly clear that I'm not the biggest fan of satirical fiction. I mean, like, I like satire in my fiction for sure, but the stuff that's labelled satire outright, like kind of quirky, humorous stuff, like John Sladek. I mean, I'm just not into that really. And Tom Disch wrote a story like that in this collection. Maybe I shouldn't be lumping them all in the same basket. I probably shouldn't. Harrison takes aim at quite a few of Wilson's books, but the most recent offending book from his perspective is The Black Room, which involves all kinds of wacky stuff, really, like sensory deprivation, hypnosis, telepathy, you name it, it's in there, stumbling between ideas without any structure to the story or character. You know, that doesn't surprise me. I've not heard many good things about Colin Wilson. My main interaction with him is watching the adaptation of his book, The Space Vampires. What's that called? Life Force. They should have just called it Space Vampires, which is a hilarious movie. It's got Patrick Stewart in, going wild, and I don't know, I think the best way I can describe it is if you got like a B-movie crew and gave them unlimited money. So instead of, improving the production in any meaningful way, they just spent more on explosives and prosthetics and went mad with it. It's pretty good. I mean, it's not good. It's entertaining. Although, like, that poor woman who plays the main vampire, she's fully nude for most of the film. Yeah, it's pretty weird. Definitely not necessary. And must have been like a, I don't know, grueling experience for her. But yeah, anyway, mad film. And I can tell that if the book is anything like the film, it would be atrocious to read. And the collection that Harrison is complimenting by Harvey Jacobs is The Egg of the Glak. So that's why we get the Black Glak. So yeah, if you want to check that out. With these essays, they're so short and so good. I'm always tempted to just read them out in their entirety. But yeah, just go and read it for yourself. I've actually got a PDF of all of M. John Harrison's criticism parietal games, which is basically impossible to come by physically. But if you want a copy of it, just DM me on Instagram and I can send it to you. Same goes for any of these New Worlds quarterlies. They're less rare, but they are out of print and may not be super easy to get hold of. But yeah, just let me know. I'm happy to share what I have. Just don't ask me where it came from. I'll read a couple of bits though, which are weirdly relevant for today, I think. One fact that both sides of the contemporary split are happy to admit: science fiction is in a mess. On one hand, a rise in sales over the past few years has brought about a corresponding drop in overall quality, a steep enough drop in Britain at least to ensure a repetition of the great slump of the 50s. On the other, a conscious turning to the rationale of art for art's sake has robbed its own products of their vitality. Perhaps 2 or 3 writers in the entire genre are managing to turn out fiction which satisfies the discerning reader while still retaining some of the traditional dynamism of the field, a pitiful showing when the immense volume of SF novels produced hardly overtops the number of writers working. Sounds pretty familiar. And then he has a go at like airport books, James Bond, Margaret Drabble, that sort of thing, which does feel like quite a boomer thing to do. I would argue that the reason those books exist is the same reason that books like this could exist. I wouldn't complain too strongly about the mass market paperback, He says here, the worst of both worlds, the Black Room, The Corpse, the novel of character, that almost apocryphal mainstream novel, embraces that of the novel of sensation. It lacks the craftsmanship and vitality that runs through even the most mediocre science fiction, and simultaneously exhibits the coarse, simplified approach that has dogged the genre since its popular mechanics days. The tragedy of the drop in standards implied by novels of this kind is twofold. A recession in publishing makes it difficult for the writer who is attempting something new and fresh to sell his work. Inevitably, when sales fall, publishers turn to the crutch of familiarity, and a lowering of the critical gate necessary to accept the mass of drivel being produced ensures that their work goes unnoticed when it finally does make it into print. That's really interesting, right? Because, especially since I think of the 70s as one of the most creative times for the science fiction genre, and the late 60s, I'm always worried that I think that because it's just so much easier to find the good books in the past, right? They've been around for longer, so there's more of a chance for word to spread about which ones are good and which ones aren't, and more reliable word as well, rather than something that comes out and then you get a bunch of effusive reviews and it's a pile of shit. I read a book like that recently. It was probably the worst book I've ever read from cover to cover. Usually quit before that happens, but I was reading it for a book club I joined. Yeah, it's awful. It's just awful. But there was always terrible stuff getting published. Not, like they say, 90% of everything is bad, right? But at the same time, if you look at the awards, like I was earlier when talking about Moorcock's introduction, the books that are getting awarded, like the Nebula, the Hugo, whatever, definitely get worse from like the 90s onwards. It's not that big of a leap to assume that this is the same thing that's happening in Hollywood, right? Just homogenization of the art. Everything's focused on safe returns. In these industries, there used to always be a pot of money set aside for the high-risk ventures, you know, which may flop, they may return huge amounts, like with the creation of an incredibly popular IP. All of the IPs you know and love today, they generally first landed latest the 90s, before this huge wave of managerialism took over, or finance, isn't it? It's all about money at the end of the day. It was always all about money. I don't want to sound like I'm harkening back to some time that didn't exist, but at least there was space to do some original stuff, which it just doesn't feel like that's the case anymore. But maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. But yeah, just mad seeing like Harrison complaining about this similar thing in the 70s. I think the main difference is he's talking about like when there's a recession in the publishing market. I don't think that's happening right now. You know, this retreat to the crutch of familiarity is happening in normal times, you know, in like when there's good business going on. I mean, I say that, I mean, like there are less people reading, so maybe sales are down. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Always interesting to get Harrison's thoughts. He's so crotchety. Right, so that's it. I was a bit worried at first, but I did end up enjoying that quite a lot. New Worlds Quarterly 3, pretty good. Sorry for the hard cut. My memory card was full, and it is now an entirely different day. But nonetheless, yeah, I liked this New Worlds Quarterly 3. I thought it was pretty solid. It was a bit touch and go around the first third. Some disappointing stories from Aldiss and Keith Roberts under the pseudonym Alistair Bevan anyway, which I was a bit surprised by. They're usually fairly reliable. Same for Tom Disch, wasn't a massive fan of his story, but I did enjoy The Grain Kings, Windows, The Machine in Shaft 10, The Head and the Hand, History Machine, Chronicle of Blackton, and the commentary from Moorcock and Harrison is always good. The Head and the Hand was by far the best story, Christopher Priest. It was worth reading this just to encounter that, really. But I did enjoy a lot of the weird experiments, particularly from Jack Dann and George Zebrowski. So yeah, pretty good, all in all. I just can't get enough of these beautiful Barclay covers, but I just wish they'd glued it together a bit better. I just realised I left the charity shop sticker on the back of this. So I can show you my way of taking stickers off, which is a foolproof method. Works extremely well. It does make you look like an absolute idiot while you're doing it. So do it in the privacy of your own homes. Helps if you got a little bit of a thumbnail going. Peel back a corner like that, enough to get a grip on. And then this is the dumb bit. You want to slowly breathe out over it as you peel the sticker back. The moisture in your breath will help the glue release. Get it to come off in one continuous piece. Otherwise you'll be scraping remnants off for ages. There you go. Nice and clean. If you hate stickers on books as much as I do, that's a handy trick. Well, next time I will probably do a video on something else, but I don't know what that is yet. But I'll be back to review some New Worlds Quarterlies soon. In the meantime, yeah, I hope you're doing all right. I hope you're reading something good. And if you're not, just put it down and move on to something else. Life's too short. See you soon.